What if I told you that Hitler's greatest enemy wasn't the Allies at all, but his own ambition? 5 times he launched massive offensives, convinced victory was already his. 5 times he gambled everything, and 5 times he lost. From the scorching deserts of North Africa, where Rommel's tanks burned beneath the relentless sun, to the frozen steppes of Russia, where entire divisions vanished in the snow. From the shattered ruins of France to the gates of Moscow itself. These weren't just military failures. They were the moments that broke the empire he tried to build. Stay until the very end, because Hitler's final offensive wasn't just desperate. It was the moment his downfall became inevitable. Let's start with the offensive that never was. Summer 1940. France had fallen. The swastika flew over Paris, and Hitler stood at the English Channel, convinced Britain would surrender. Operation Sea Lion. That was the plan. A massive amphibious invasion across the Channel. Thousands of barges, hundreds of thousands of troops. Hitler believed one coordinated strike would break the British will. But there was a problem. Hitler didn't have naval superiority. The Royal Navy outnumbered the Kriegsmarine. His generals told him it was suicide. But Hitler was convinced. He ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF first. If the skies were German, the invasion could work. So the bombing began. Wave after wave of German fighters and bombers descended on England. But the British were ready. Radar stations spotted incoming squadrons before they crossed the coast. Spitfires scrambled to intercept. And inexplicably to Hitler, these young British pilots refused to break. The Battle of Britain raged through the summer and into autumn. Day after day, the Luftwaffe threw everything at RAF airfields and aircraft factories. But supplies ran low. Pilots were exhausted. And still, the RAF fought back. Then came the Blitz. Terror bombing on London meant to shatter British morale. Instead, it forged their resolve. Londoners huddled in subway tunnels, emerging to dig through rubble, searching for survivors. The more Hitler bombed, the more determined they became. By October, the Luftwaffe was broken. Pilots were dead. Planes were lost. Reserves were depleted. Hitler called off the invasion. Sea Lion had failed before it began. And for the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility cracked. Stung by failure, Hitler made a decision that would haunt him forever. If he couldn't conquer the West, he would conquer the East. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers, tanks, trucks, artillery, all surging eastward across the Soviet Union. Blitzkrieg on steroids. Hitler was convinced the Red Army would crumble in weeks. Soviet resistance, he believed, was a paper tiger. One decisive blow, and the entire Soviet system would collapse. The invasion was ferocious. German forces pushed 500 kilometers into Soviet territory in the first month alone. Soviet forces were shattered, encircled, destroyed. Entire armies surrendered. Hundreds of thousands of men became prisoners. But something unexpected happened. The Soviets didn't surrender. They retreated. They scorched the earth. They traded land for time. And then came winter. German troops still wore summer uniforms. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Fingers snapped from frostbite. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin across frozen steppes. In December, the Red Army counterattacked with fresh troops from Siberia, trained to fight in sub-zero cold. German forces were pushed back from Moscow. For the first time in the war, Hitler's offensive had failed. Barbarossa was supposed to be a 3-month campaign. It became a 10-year nightmare. Still convinced he could win, Hitler launched another massive offensive. Summer 1942. Operation Fall Blau. The plan was to drive south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Victory, he believed, was just over the horizon. German forces surged south and east, and then Hitler's eye fell on a city that bore his enemy's name, Stalingrad. What should have been a strategic bypass became an obsession. Hitler was determined to capture it. Stalin was determined to hold it, and neither man would back down. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into twisted rubble. But instead of clearing a path, the destruction created the perfect defensive terrain. Streets became trenches, basements became bunkers, entire apartment blocks changed hands daily. German soldiers fought block by block, street by street, stairwell by stairwell. For months they pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. But Soviet defenders clung on. Snipers turned rubble into killing zones. Reinforcements slipped across the Volga under cover of darkness. Supplies ran low. Morale ran lower. Frostbite spread. Starvation followed. Then, in November, the Soviets sprung their trap. Operation Uranus, a massive double envelopment that encircled the entire German Sixth Army. 300,000 German soldiers suddenly found themselves surrounded. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground. "Resupply by air," he commanded. It never came. The airlift failed. Supplies couldn't reach the trapped men. Soldiers ate their horses. They ate their leather belts. They froze to death in the rubble. By February 1943, it was over. Nearly 300,000 men had entered Stalingrad. Fewer than 100,000 limped out. The rest were dead or captured. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a gut punch. For the Red Army, it was proof the Nazi war machine could bleed. Still desperate to regain the initiative, Hitler devised one final grand offensive on the Eastern Front. Summer 1943, Operation Citadel. The target, the city of Kursk. Soviet forces had created a massive bulge in the front lines around Kursk. Hitler saw an opportunity. If he could encircle and destroy the Soviet armies there, he could restore momentum to the Eastern Front. But the Soviets were ready. Soviet intelligence had warned Stalin exactly when and where the Germans would attack, and Stalin transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress. Over 1 million Red Army soldiers dug in. Trenches, bunkers, minefields, anti-tank defenses layered upon anti-tank defenses. The Soviets created something the Germans had never faced before. A defense in depth so complete, so overwhelming, that it was nearly impenetrable. On July 5, 1943, the German attack began. And it was ferocious. Over 6,000 tanks rumbled across the fields in what became the largest armored battle in history. Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinands clashed head-on with T-34s in an apocalyptic collision of steel and fire. The skies buzzed with dogfights. Artillery lit the horizon like hellfire, but German progress was agonizingly slow. Tanks broke down. Mines devastated columns. The deeper German forces pushed, the more resistance they encountered. On July 12th at Prokhorovka, the largest tank engagement in history took place. Soviet and German armor clashed in a brutal melee. For days the battle raged, but the Germans couldn't break through. Then the Soviets counterattacked. Operation Kutuzov and Operation Polkovodets. Massive Soviet offensive operations that slammed into German flanks and forced a retreat. Hitler called off the attack. Kursk was a catastrophe. And from that moment forward, the Red Army stopped defending. It started advancing. The Germans would never launch another successful offensive on the Eastern Front. By late 1944, Germany was dying. The Western Front was collapsing. The Eastern Front was in full retreat. Hitler's generals begged him to negotiate, to surrender, to accept defeat. But Hitler refused. He had one final card to play. December 1944, Operation Winter Storm, the Battle of the Bulge, one last desperate gamble through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The plan was audacious. Insane, really. German forces would punch through Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was desperation masquerading as strategy. But for a brief moment, it worked. 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed through American lines. Under cover of snow and fog, they achieved surprise. Roads clogged with retreating troops. Supply lines were cut. Chaos erupted. A massive bulge formed in the Allied front line, giving the battle its name. But then American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne dug in at Bastogne, a strategic crossroads. Surrounded, cold, running low on supplies, they refused to surrender. When Germans demanded their capitulation, Brigadier General McAuliffe replied with one word: nuts. Meanwhile, General Patton executed a lightning-fast maneuver, wheeling his army north and punching through German lines to relieve Bastogne. The skies cleared. Allied aircraft returned. German reinforcements failed to materialize. By January, the Germans were in full retreat. They had lost over 100,000 men and irreplaceable equipment. It was Hitler's final offensive in the West, and it ended in catastrophic failure. 5 offensives, 5 crushing defeats. Sea Lion never happened. Barbarossa bled Germany dry. Stalingrad broke the Wehrmacht's spirit. Kursk proved German armor was no longer supreme, and the Bulge was the last desperate gasp of a dying empire. Each one represented Hitler's refusal to accept reality, his conviction that willpower could overcome logistics, that ideology could defeat strategy, that one more offensive, one more gamble would somehow turn it all around. But it never did. These 5 offensives didn't just fail militarily. They failed strategically. They failed economically. They consumed resources Hitler could never replace. They destroyed soldiers he could never recruit. They shattered the myth that the Third Reich was unstoppable. Because in the end, that's what these 5 offensives proved: that empires built on conquest eventually run out of conquered territories, that armies built on aggression eventually face opponents who won't break, that leaders convinced of their own invincibility eventually meet their match. Hitler thought one more offensive would change everything. Instead, each one brought him closer to ruin. And when Berlin finally fell, it wasn't because of one decisive Allied blow. It was because 5 failed offensives had bled Germany white, because Hitler's own ambition had destroyed his own empire. That's the lesson of these 5 offensives: not triumph, but the slow, inevitable consequences of refusing to accept defeat.